There are watches that tell time, and then there are watches that tell people who you are. For the last decade, nothing has done that louder than a Richard Mille. But those conditions are starting to change, and not for the better. But the question isn't whether Richard Mille is failing, it's whether the world that made it unstoppable still exists. Let's break it down. The audacity. In 1999, the Swiss watch industry had a rulebook: gold cases, hand finishing, centuries of heritage. The older the brand, the more legitimate it was. If your family hadn't been making movements since Napoleon was alive, you were essentially a newcomer with no standing. The industry ran on this logic the way old law firms run on seniority. So the system was not about producing better work, but about protecting the people already inside. Richard Mille walked into that world with none of the credentials it valued. He wasn't a watchmaker. He wasn't a craftsman from a dynasty of craftsmen. He was a former executive at Mauboussin, a jewelry and watch distributor. He understood the industry from the commercial side, how watches moved, how retailers thought, what collectors actually responded to versus what they said they responded to. That commercial knowledge turned out to be more useful than heritage. His idea sounds simple now. It wasn't simple in 1999. Build a watch the way engineers build racing cars. Optimize for performance. Strip everything that doesn't serve a function. Use materials from aerospace and Formula One because those materials are lighter and stronger than gold or steel, and make the movement completely visible. His idea wasn't to do this as decoration, but as a philosophical statement that the watch has nothing to hide. But the Swiss establishment that guarded the system didn't take him seriously. A few watchmakers agreed to work with him anyway. One of them was Renault et Papy, a specialist movement manufacturer in Le Local that had made complicated movements for major brands. They built his first serious movement. It was a collaboration born partly of curiosity and partly of the fact that Mille was willing to pay for the kind of development work that larger brands had stopped commissioning. The first watch, the RM001, launched at the SIHH in 2001. Skeletonized tourbillon movement, titanium case with a shape unlike anything else on the market. It wasn't round or rectangular. It was something between the two, with the proportions of a barrel turned on its side. The price is approximately $200,000. For a brand that had existed for less than 2 years, with no archives, no famous clients from the previous century, no story of surviving 2 world wars with the family firm intact, the reaction were just as you'd expect. Watch forums reacted with a mixture of confusion and contempt. A tourbillon at that price from a brand nobody had heard of. A case design that looked like it came from a science fiction film. An owner who was talking about aerospace engineering and Formula One when everyone else was talking about guilloche dials and hand-beveled bridges. Some of the criticism was legitimate. Some of it was protectionism dressed as connoisseurship. Either way, it created noise. And for a new luxury brand trying to establish itself, that noise is infinitely more valuable than silence. The question wasn't whether people liked it. The question was whether people could stop talking about it. They couldn't. But there was still so much for Richard Mille to do. The proof. The purists weren't still keen on Richard Mille's aesthetic. The watches looked wrong by the standards of traditional watchmaking. And the elites that guarded the system of hierarchy in luxury watchmaking saw it as an abomination to the hierarchical structure. To them, the brand had no history, and the prices were unjustifiable on that alone. But Mille had a plan. It took a strategic decision to answer every aesthetic and historical objection with a physical test. There wasn't a point arguing when judgment was already passed. The test had to show the watch doing something that nothing else at that price point can do, then document it publicly. But showing the watch could pull its own weight wasn't enough. They needed a big stage, and in 2010, they got it. They formalized their partnership with Rafael Nadal, and at that moment, their strategy became undeniable. Nadal wore the RM027 during Wimbledon, through 5 sets of professional tennis, with wrist speeds reaching beyond 100 kilometers per hour, on some strokes and impact forces that would destroy most watches not designed for it. The tourbillon that made the watch look untraditional made it durable, and this is what I mean. A tourbillon is a cage that rotates the escapement to average out the effect of gravity on timekeeping accuracy. It's one of the most mechanically complicated achievements in watchmaking. The The components inside a tourbillon cage are measured in fractions of a millimeter. The tolerances are so tight that a single human hair introduced into the mechanism during assembly would stop it functioning. Watchmakers treat a finished tourbillon the way surgeons treat a transplanted organ, with extreme caution, controlled environments, minimal stress. You don't play tennis with a tourbillon on your wrist. No watchmaker in Switzerland in 2010 would have told you that was a good idea. The RM027 weighed under 20 grams total. Movement, case, strap. The complete watch weighed less than most metal bracelets. And it survived Wimbledon. 5 sets. Center court. Cameras on the wrist the entire time. That's not a marketing claim. That's a fact with photographic evidence, broadcast footage, and millions of witnesses. More partnerships followed in quick succession. Felipe Massa wore an RM through Formula One races, including crashes that produced G-forces capable of destroying conventional watches entirely. Bubba Watson wore the RM038 during competitive golf swings. Johan Blake wore the RM59-01 while sprinting. Jackie Chan, who famously does his own stunts, allegedly wore Richard Mille's during filming. The watch being worn by celebrities who put them through stressful situations was a bigger proof-of-concept test rather than just endorsement obligations. From being nothing, Richard Mille became more, and from then on, it destroyed the hierarchy's categorization of watches. Before Richard Mille, a luxury watch existed in one of two categories: dress watches or sports watches. Dress watches were jewelry that happened to tell the time. Sports watches were robust tools that happened to be expensive. Neither category had room for a watch that cost $200,000 and could survive a tennis match at Wimbledon. Mille created a third category: the performance jewelry. The object was precious, genuinely precious, with movement work that required hundreds of hours from skilled craftsmen. But the preciousness didn't make it fragile. The preciousness and the durability weren't in tension. They were the same thing. That reframing changed what the watch was selling. Not heritage. Not status derived from someone else's history. Proof that you could afford the thing that performs best under the conditions that matter most. The price stopped being an objection and started being a filter. Which athlete partnership do you think sold the most watches? Drop the name in the comments. The meta game. Something shifted around 2014 and 2015, not in the watches, in the buyers. The watches were still the same. Still carbon composite cases. Still skeletonized movements with components machined to tolerances measured in microns. Still priced in ways that made Rolex look accessible. The engineering hadn't changed. The production philosophy hadn't changed. The partnership strategy was still running. What changed was who was showing up to buy. The original Richard Mille customer was a specific type. Usually male. Usually self-made in some field. Finance, sport, entertainment, technology. Someone who genuinely understood or at least genuinely appreciated the engineering story because they lived in a world where performance under pressure meant something personally. The watch was expensive because they could afford expensive things. It was this expensive thing specifically because the story resonated with how they saw themselves. By the mid-2010s, a second type of buyer had appeared. Someone who had seen the first type wearing the watch. Someone who had done the research, understood the cultural coding, and wanted in. Not because of the engineering specifically, because of what the engineering signaled about the person wearing it. This is not unique to Richard Mille. Every luxury brand eventually faces this transition. The question is whether you manage it or let it manage you. Mille managed it, at least initially, through price. The entry point by 2015 was roughly $100,000. Not for a complication-heavy flagship, just to get in the door. That number did something specific. It set a financial bar high enough that casual aspiration couldn't clear it. You couldn't save up for a year to buy a Richard Mille. You needed actual wealth, or, at minimum, actual liquidity to participate. The RM011 became the reference that defined this era. Felipe Massa flyback chronograph, carbon or titanium case depending on the version. The case shape that had seemed alien in 2001 had by this point become an icon recognizable at distance, in photographs, on wrists in nightclub photos and courtside at NBA games and paddock passes at Monaco. It didn't look subtle because it wasn't trying to be subtle. The economics of this period were genuinely strange. By 2017, Richard Mille was producing somewhere in the range of 4,000 watches per year, a tiny number compared to the tens of thousands that brands like Audemars Piguet and Patek Philippe produce annually. Average transaction price, around $170,000. Total annual revenue, approaching $800 million. 4,000 watches, $800 million. Patek Philippe, a brand founded in 1839 with 180 years of history and arguably the most respected name in watchmaking, produces roughly 60,000 watches a year and has revenue in a similar range. Richard Mille, founded in 2001, was generating roughly 40 times the revenue per watch. The explanation for this wasn't simply that the watches were better, or that the engineering was more impressive. Part of the explanation was that Richard Mille had solved a problem that afflicts every luxury status signal eventually: imitation. You can fake a Rolex Submariner. Counterfeit versions flood the gray market. You can buy a fake for $100 that passes casual inspection. The brand has spent decades fighting this, and the fakes keep coming, because at $6,000 to $12,000 retail, the incentive for forgery is enormous. You cannot practically fake a Richard Mille. Not at $100,000 minimum. The secondary market for genuine pieces is too liquid, too well documented, and too full of people who know exactly what they're looking at. A fake RM in the room where the real money is sitting doesn't get compliments. It gets questions you can't answer. Questions about which generation of the case architecture, which movement variant, whether the crown locking system operates the way it should. The people who buy real ones at that price point have done their research. They're not fooled by a good photograph. The watch didn't just sell visibility. It sold visibility that couldn't be undermined. That's a specific luxury proposition. And for several years, it was essentially unassailable. There's another layer to this period that deserves its own attention. The retail experience Richard Mille built was unlike anything else in the industry. Not the boutique specifically, though those are deliberately minimal, clinical almost, the aesthetic of a laboratory rather than a jewelry shop. The experience of buying. No advertising in traditional media. No department store counters. No gray market authorized dealers. You bought from a Richard Mille boutique, directly, or you bought on the secondary market. The brand controlled its distribution with a discipline that most Swiss houses had abandoned decades ago in pursuit of volume. What this created was a waiting dynamic, not the theatrical waiting list of a Hermes Birkin, where scarcity is partly manufactured and partly genuine. A functional waiting reality where production genuinely couldn't meet demand because production was deliberately constrained. 4,000 watches a year is a curatorial number. It says we choose who gets these. It says the relationship between maker and owner matters more than quarterly revenue targets. For buyers at this level, people with genuine wealth, used to getting what they want immediately, being made to wait is a specific kind of flattery. It says the brand doesn't need you more than you need it. That's not a common thing to feel from a luxury purchase. It's addictive when you do. The RM011 was the watch. What came next was the empire. And empires have a specific kind of vulnerability. The saturation. The problem with a signal that exists primarily to separate you from everyone else is that the signal depends on everyone else not having it. Somewhere in 2020 and 2021, the signal started to crack. The catalyst was a combination of factors that individually wouldn't have mattered, but together changed something real. Crypto wealth arrived suddenly, in large quantities, and with buying habits that moved faster than traditional luxury markets were built to handle. A 26-year-old who had been holding Ethereum since 2017 wasn't going to wait 18 months on a waiting list. He was going to pay the secondary market premium and have the watch shipped within the week. And that's exactly what happened. Thousands of times. Secondary market prices for the RM011 reached premiums of 40, 50, 60% above retail. The watches were trading like assets because for a period they functioned like assets. Buyers who had paid $200,000 retail were seeing those same pieces worth $300,000 on Chrono 24 within 2 years. Social media accelerated everything. The "just copped the RM" post became a genre. YouTube unboxings, Instagram flex culture, TikTok wrist checks. The watch appeared in contexts that had nothing to do with the engineering philosophy Mille had spent 20 years building. It appeared as a flex object, a liquid wealth signal, a way of saying, in one wrist glance, that the rules that apply to other people don't apply to you. None of this is objectively bad for a luxury brand's short-term revenue. More buyers means more demand. More secondary market premiums means the product retains value. The financial metrics looked fine. What was shifting was harder to measure, and more important, the original collector community was quietly leaving. Watch forums that had spent years debating whether Richard Mille deserved its position started filling with a different kind of thread. Not, is this engineering legitimate? But, where do I go now? Collectors who had worn Richard Mille's as a genuine expression of their interest in mechanical performance started drifting toward independent watchmakers. F.P. Journe, whose output is deliberately limited and whose waiting lists are genuinely long. Philippe Dufour, who makes around 30 watches per year by hand and has been doing so for decades. M.B.&F., whose machines' functions reference objects are willfully strange in ways that reward knowledge rather than just wealth. The move wasn't dramatic. No one issued a press release. But the collectors who had given the brand its cultural legitimacy in the first place, the ones whose opinions moved other opinions, were spending their money somewhere else. The design decisions made during this period didn't help. The RM88 automatic tourbillon Smiley launched in 2020. A tourbillon complication, one of the highest achievements in traditional watchmaking, combined with a smiley face displayed through the dial. The price was around $450,000. The piece sold. It got coverage, and it created a specific tension that the brand's most serious admirers couldn't easily resolve. A smiley face on a $450,000 tourbillon is not an engineering statement. It's a personality statement, which is fine. Brands are allowed to have personality. But Richard Mille's authority had always come from the idea that the watches earned their prices through performance. The RM52 series, which included a skull motif, a racing helmet case, and an RM shaped around a horsepower symbol, attracted buyers who were coming for the iconography, not the movement architecture. That's a different customer. And when your brand's value proposition is built on the idea that the watch earns its right to exist through what it can survive, the customer who buys because of a skull complication is carrying something that slightly undermines the story for everyone else wearing the brand. RM88 Smiley. Do you think it is a design evolution, or the moment Mille lost the plot? The correction. In 2023, the secondary market started behaving differently. It wasn't collapsing, but correcting. The gap between those two things is significant, and most coverage of this period collapsed them together. The RM011 references that had been trading at 40 to 60% above retail started moving toward retail. Not below retail, the watches weren't losing value in absolute terms. The hype premium was deflating. The buyer who had paid $280,000 for a watch with a $200,000 retail price was finding that the next buyer wasn't willing to pay $280,000 anymore. They were willing to pay $210,000, maybe $215,000. In the context of any other luxury market, this would be unremarkable. Premiums deflate. Markets correct. That's normal. In the context of a brand whose secondary market premiums had become part of the mythology, part of the proof that the brand had transcended normal luxury dynamics, it was noticed. The forums noticed. The resellers noticed. The collectors who had been treating their pieces partly as investments noticed most of all. There's a particular kind of buyer who enters a market when premiums are climbing. They're not collectors. They're not enthusiasts. They're traders using the language of enthusiasm because it's the culture of the community they've entered. When the premiums compress, they leave. Not with drama, not with public statements, but quietly relisting their pieces at realistic prices and redirecting the capital somewhere else. The departure of these buyers is actually healthy for any collecting category long-term. In the short term, it shows up as softening prices, reduced trading volume, and a general sense that something has shifted. That's what 2023 looked like for Richard Mille on the secondary market. The RMUP01 Ferrari, unveiled in 2022, crystallized the tension in a way nothing before it had. The watch is, technically, a genuine achievement. 1.75 millimeters thick from caseback to crystal. the thinnest mechanical watch ever made at the time of its launch. The movement required years of engineering work from a team that essentially invented new fabrication techniques for the project. The sapphire crystal is load-bearing, which had never been done before at this scale. Measured purely as an engineering project, it stands alongside anything the brand had ever made. The price? $2 million. And here is where the problem lies. The RM Up 01 is so thin that it cannot be worn during athletic activity. It's not a watch you put on a Formula One driver or a tennis player or a sprinter. It's a watch you wear to dinner, a very expensive dinner, with people who understand what they're looking at. But dinner, not the proving ground that the brand spent 20 years establishing as the test that mattered. A $2 million watch that cannot do what the brand was built on doing creates a crack, but not a fatal one. The buyers who had followed Mille because they believed in the proposition, performance justified price, were now being asked to pay $2 million for something that justified its price through engineering achievement rather than engineering function. Those are different things. The questions that had always been submerged by the hype now had room to surface. Is the price justified by what the watch can do, or by the story of what watches like this could once do? Is this still equipment, or is it equipment mythology? Is the watch earning its right to exist through performance? Or is the performance narrative now just the brand voice for objects that are actually, fundamentally, jewelry? Those questions don't have simple answers. Some long-term owners will tell you the questions are unfair, that the RM Up 01 represents exactly the philosophy the brand was built on, push the engineering to its absolute limit, regardless of the application. Others will tell you that when you lose the athlete on the court, you've lost the proof that made everything else believable. Both positions are defensible. The fact that they're now openly debated is the change. The watch didn't get weaker. The story around it got louder than the watch. Those aren't the same problem, but they feel like the same problem when you're living through it. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. You walk into a store or browse online, and everything looks the same, but behind the scenes, there's a system. Prices aren't always fair, availability is controlled, and one bad decision can leave you overpaying for something that doesn't even hold its value. That's why I created a complete free insider guide to buying watches. Inside, you'll find the best watches to buy, the watches to avoid, and how to choose a watch that actually fits your style and budget long term. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the free guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part, the truth. Let me be precise about what Richard Mille is right now. There is no fall. There is something more complicated. The brand is financially strong. It's a private company, no public filings, no obligation to share revenue numbers, but production volumes and average transaction prices point to annual revenue comfortably above $1 billion. They opened a 45,000 square meter manufacture in Les Breuilous in 2021. That's not a building you commission when you think the business is in trouble. They own significant portions of their supply chain. The movements are produced in-house or by closely held partners. They are not at the mercy of third-party component suppliers the way many watch brands are. Culturally, the watches still work as a status signal. Walk into any room where serious wealth is concentrated. The paddock at a Grand Prix, a private equity conference, the hospitality suites at a major tennis tournament, and Richard Milles are present. The shorthand hasn't expired. The recognition is still instant. What has changed is the quality of the question being asked. For the first 15 years of the brand's life, the question was essentially whether Richard Mille had the right to exist. Critics said no. The secondary market said yes. The secondary market won. Once that argument was settled, no serious person reopened it. The question now is different. It's not about existence. It's about direction. It's about whether the brand that built its entire authority on the idea that watches earn their price through performance is still making choices that serve that idea, or whether the idea has become a heritage narrative for a brand that is actually moving in a different direction. Picture the collector who bought an RM 11 inches 2009 because the engineering story was real to him. He's followed the brand for 15 years. He's watched the athlete partnerships. He's worn the watch in conditions that tested it. He owns 2 or 3 references by now. He has genuine knowledge of what makes these movements different from anything else at the price point. He's looking at the RM88 Smiley. He's looking at the RM UP01 at $2 million that he can't take to the tennis court. He's reading the press releases about new celebrity partnerships that have nothing to do with athletic performance. And he's not angry. He's not writing a forum post denouncing the brand. He's just quiet. He's redirecting money that would have gone toward the next Richard Mille into a conversation with an independent watchmaker in Geneva who makes 40 pieces a year and doesn't need celebrity partnerships to justify the price. That quietness is the real signal, not the secondary market softening, not the design debates, the quietness of the people whose endorsement made the brand worth arguing about. Serious collectors who spoke to me while researching this topic used one word with specific consistency: re-evaluation. The distinction matters. Rejection is a door closing. Re-evaluation is a door that remains open but requires the brand to come through it differently than it has been. The people who bought for the engineering philosophy, who wore the watches because they genuinely believed in what the watches represented, most of them still believe the early work was legitimate. The RM67-02 Ultralight is still one of the most technically accomplished sports watches made in the last 20 years. The tourbillon work in the foundational references still holds up under scrutiny from people who understand what they're looking at. The brand's best work is genuinely impressive. This is not a story of a fraud being exposed. It is a story of a brand reckoning with the consequences of its own success, which is, as reckonings go, one of the better problems to have. But it is still a reckoning, and reckonings require answers. The answer the brand gives over the next 5 years will determine whether Richard Mille enters a second era built on a deepened version of the original philosophy, or whether it drifts toward becoming a very expensive jewelry brand with a performance mythology living in its archive, referenced in brand history documents that nobody reads before they buy. Both paths are available. Only one of them is consistent with what Richard Mille built his name on. Richard Mille didn't build a great luxury brand by making better watches than everyone else, though the engineering is serious and the best work is defensible on pure technical grounds. He built it by changing the question. Not which brand has the longest history, but which watch can you put on your wrist at Wimbledon and still trust to function. Not which movement has the most traditional finishing, but what does this watch prove about the person wearing it? That was the question for 20 years. The answer was obvious, and the brand owned it completely. The reevaluation happening now is the market asking whether the brand still answers the same question. $2 million for the thinnest watch ever made is an engineering achievement. It is not Nadal at Wimbledon. The market knows the difference. The serious collectors know the difference. Every brand that lasts long enough eventually faces a version of this. The ones that survive it are the ones that remember why people started paying attention in the first place and return to that reason deliberately, not as nostalgia, but as direction. The question for Richard Mille is not whether it can survive. It's demonstrably surviving. The question is whether the brand that comes out the other side of this reevaluation period still means what it once meant to the people whose opinions made it mean something to everyone else. If you've ever stood in front of a watch display and felt something pull at you, a piece you had no business wanting, at a price that made no rational sense, that feeling has a name. It's not irrationality. Its taste is formed in real time. The problem is nobody teaches you how to read it. I put together a guide specifically for that stage. How to evaluate a watch on its own terms without the price tag doing the thinking for you. What separates a movement worth understanding from a movement worth owning. And why the piece in the corner that nobody's photographing is sometimes the most important watch in the room. It's in the pinned comment. 2 minutes. Worth it. One word is Richard Mille's best era behind it or ahead. Let me know in the comments. Like this video and subscribe.